Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming along. We've got a slightly different format from our usual today. Greg Stride from the Local Government Information Unit has come along to talk about his recent report on the state of local government finance, and then Dan will be doing his session on looking at the accounts, what to look forward to in the next set of accounts, and what's been really useful actually supporting some of the work that Greg's done as well. So the two do mesh together nicely. And then the last session will be me doing a bit of an update on the MTFP model and what that looks like, and the latest version that we brought out. And if we've got time, looking a little bit at the local government manifesto that the Labour Party brought out just before the local. So just seeing what that means for us in terms of local government funding. Just to remind you that the session's been recorded. I'll get the recording on the website as soon as possible afterwards. But for now, I'll pass over to Greg. Yeah, welcome,
Thank you very much. Thank you, Adrian, and thank you very much for inviting me. And yeah, to everyone who I haven't seen before, my name is Dr. Greg Stride, and I'm from the Local Government Information Unit. I'm a senior researcher, and we did a report earlier this year on the state of local government finance. If anyone wants to go and read this report, it's freely available on our website, and I would recommend giving it a look, because everything I say today is said in more detail and more coherently in that report. I would recommend giving it a look if you can. So essentially what we were trying to do is get an inside look at the state of local government finance in England. We've been doing this for about 10 years. You can go back and read all our previous reports, and we ask roughly the same types of questions in some cases, but we also switch it up depending on the annual context. And essentially what we're trying to do here is get a subjective view of what council finances look like from the point of view of people who are trying to make them work. So we ask the chief finance officers or section 151 officers, we ask the chief executives, we ask the council leaders, and we ask the cabinet members for finance in places where there are such a person. We sent it out on January 31st. So pretty key to the sequencing of this is this was after the announcement of the additional funding that came after the provisional funding settlement in December. So the 600 million or so that was for adult social care and these sorts of things, that had already been announced by this point. So when the government responded to our research and said, oh, we've given this additional funding, everybody answering the survey already knew that. So that was, I wouldn't say, an ideal response to what we were saying. We had 160 responses from 128 unique councils, and these were, I would say, broadly representative across, we had different types of council, in roughly the proportion that they appear in across England, which was really good and quite lucky as well. And then we also had lots of different party balances, so there was nothing out of the ordinary there. And we also got a decent response from each of these different types of people, so leaders, chief execs, directors of finance, and cabinet members for finance. So very, very happy with the representativeness of this survey. Which I already said. Oh, and region as well. I should mention region because this is something that comes up very frequently, and I have a few graphs split up by region because we all know, and we obviously just seen from the Rural Services Network that things can be very different in different places. I just want to say briefly that the idea of doing this sort of subjective research as opposed to the quite hard granular financial data that you're probably more used to seeing in this audience is it does a few different things, but mostly it shows us the mood of the sector as opposed to the sort of way that things are changing in granular objective detail. And I think there's reasons to think that that's quite useful. One of those reasons is that I expect lots of people on this call will have seen it. The Times published something, I think it was just over a week ago, using off-log data that I think didn't tell us very much about the financial health of the sector at all. I don't think it was very useful, but that was using this sort of objective measures of data collected by off-log, whereas what we're doing is sort of self-consciously subjective. So to go into the results, to blast through it, we've got the first thing we asked is about confidence in council finances. How confident do you feel about the sustainability of local government finance? We've been asking this every year in exactly this wording since 2017, usually getting responses from roughly the same types of people. And we can see that for some reason, it has cratered in 2024. We ask it in the January of every year. We were trying to figure out exactly why this might be, and I think there's a large part of it that will be the Birmingham effect, but also there are things going on internally in different councils that are making things more complicated year on year, and we'll get into that in a second. But as to quite why the drop is this big from last year, I think it's not exactly a mystery, but that is a huge difference. Just this drop of 10% or 10 percentage points, I should say, in 1 year is quite big. So this is something that if anybody has any comments on exactly why this might be, that the different causal mechanisms that are leading into this kind of thing, that would be really useful. to learn more about. And if we can readjust our survey, which we will be doing next year, to capture exactly why this confidence is changing, that would be fantastic. This is a quote that came from an anonymous person who filled in the survey. "It feels the worst I've ever known it, even when I started in the early 90s, with no prospect of change. Chief finance officer conferences feel like more like group therapy nowadays." I think there's 2 points here: the way that it feels being the worst, and also the no prospect of change. And I think that's one of the things to do with sustainability, is that it's quite forward looking. And if there's no prospect of change, then you're very unlikely to be confident in the state of local government finances. This wasn't, well, yeah, we can come on to what other people thought about the future of local government finances in just a moment. We asked about Section 114 notices, and we asked across 2 different time periods, if there are no changes to local government funding, how likely do you think it is that your council will issue a Section 114 notice in 2024-25? 9% of respondents, not 9% of councils, 9% of respondents, said that they were like very or quite likely to issue a Section 114 in the next year, next financial year, I should say. And then over the next 5 years, it was half of all councils. And just to briefly get into this, sorry, half of all respondents, it was actually more than half of all councils. Over the next 5 years, the reason that this is so, yeah, I mean, I don't need to get into the reason that people are so underconfident in these sorts of things, but we heard a lot of things in the written evidence about reserves dwindling, essentially, and meaning that over the next 5 years, if reserves continue to dwindle on the same, or continue to be depleted in the same way, then eventually there will be no way to buoy up a balanced budget in that year. This was true across different tiers of local authorities, so it was equally true across upper and lower tier authorities, which we weren't exactly expecting. We thought there might have been, sorry, there's some noise coming through. We thought there might have been a difference between upper and lower tier authorities, but really there was no difference that we could see between these. So this is happening across the sector, across regions, and across different types of council. This was just a sort of illustrative example of what people were saying. So years of cuts have left local government on its knees, reserves have been utilised, and now many more Section 114 notices will follow. It is simply unsustainable and unacceptable to continue to place burdens on local authorities without sufficient funding to compensate them for these. This is something that came up very frequently. We have another slide in a second, is that funding is not changing in accordance with the amount that burdens on local authorities are changing. So the responsibilities local authorities have is going up much faster than the funding that is required to keep up with them. And in particular, we saw things about home to school transport came up very frequently, and then homelessness came up frequently across district councils, and waste collection was coming up quite often as well, and these changing responsibilities there. Just to demonstrate that it's true across the different regions, I mean, this, because of the size of the sample, this is essentially the same proportion across everywhere. So pretty much everywhere said that they were likely to, or about half of councils in every region said they were likely to announce a 114 in the next 5 years. I'm probably not demonstrating how worrying this is, because I've read this so many times, but yeah, this is when the results were coming in, I was absolutely certain, well, not certain, but I was worried that I'd done something wrong with the survey design because the proportion was so high. But we checked it and checked it and checked it, and this is what it looks like. We asked about the different things that are going on in local government at the moment. So we asked, how much of a problem do you think these different things are in local government finance? Additional pressure on council finances caused by inflation at 94%. This is to be expected during an inflationary crisis. It makes everything more expensive, which adds more pressure. It's roughly the same as when we asked the same question last year. Additional pressures on services caused by the cost of living crisis. Again, roughly the same as last year, over 90% of respondents. Recruiting or retaining staff. This is something that we want to do more research into. We've seen some things come out from different organizations about why it's so difficult to recruit or retain staff. But this is overwhelmingly negative to have over 90% say that this is causing a problem in the council. And then just under, we've got responsibilities growing without funding increases. That's what I was just talking about a second ago. That's near 90% as well. So these things you could describe as near unanimously every council thinks they're a problem, essentially. And then you've got other ones that are slightly less. So about half of respondents said the local authority audit backlog is an issue. And this is such a sort of complicated thing to understand from the council perspective that I'm actually sitting on quite a lot of evidence that we don't really know. We're trying to get academics who are experts in local government audit and different audit bodies from different places to have a look at this this evidence that we've collected, because it's really interesting to know how the local authority audit backlog is affecting different councils, including we have written evidence from lots of different chief finance officers and whoever who say to differing levels, either it means that we don't really know what's happening across the sector, or it doesn't really bother us. There's quite a wide spectrum of opinions on that. And I think Dan said he was going to come back to some things on that. The ring fencing of local authority budgets, 47%. So this is something that is seen as a problem by about half of respondents. The interesting thing about this is how different it is from our Scotland results. We did a very similar survey in Scotland in December 2023, where it was something like 95% of Scottish local authorities think that ring fencing is a problem up there. So this is one of those things that appears to be a divergence based on devolution of local government funding. And then we have this one, inefficiencies in council spending leading to significant waste of resources, down at 11%. I don't think this is too surprising. Councils have been cutting their budgets for years and years. If there were huge amounts of money being wasted, firstly, you might expect it to have already been cut, but also you might not expect that to be something that people sort of think is a significant problem in comparison to the other problems. Balancing the budget. So we asked the different proportion taking each of these measures. So increasing council tax, 91% said they will be increasing council tax, plus, and this is 84% of all respondents are raising council tax by the maximum possible amount. A little bit surprising that the increase in council tax isn't higher, but that's probably due to people not answering the question. But we can. This is one of the things where we can look at what each council does and compare it to our result. Increasing fees or charges, that was again about 90%. We did ask what types of fees and charges you're changing, because that's something that newspapers always want to know. But unfortunately, the answer was all of them for nearly everybody. So newspapers came to me and said, oh, which fees and charges are they increasing? I just had to say, well, look up a list of all the fees and charges and just write that down. Spending reserves, 2/3 of councils said they would be spending reserves in this financial year, 2024-25. That's, well, we'll come to a slide on that in just a second, but that's very high. That's much higher than the ideal amount, which would be hardly any. Cutting spending on services, 2/3 again. And the services that they said they would be cutting on, we'll come back to that again in a second. Increasing commercial activity, 36% of councils said they would be doing, so 1/3. Increasing commercial activity is one of those, it's a more controversial topic, but it is one of the places where councils do have flexibility to make more money, depending on where they are. But it is not relevant to how much money your council needs, how commercially successful they're likely to be. So it's one of those things that is a complete divergence from, between needs and the funding available, essentially. Increasing borrowing, 20% of councils said they would do that, but as everyone on this call will be well aware, that's not really relevant to being able to balance a budget, not entirely, because you can only do so much with borrowed money as a council. The proportion saying they would take none of the above was, I think, 1%, and they may have misunderstood the question or not answered. So, spending reserves. So we asked, did your council use their reserves in 2023-24? If you remember, we were asking this very near the financial year end of 2023-24, and 77% of the respondents said they had used their reserves. We also asked, like I just said, 2/3 said they would use their reserves in 2024-25. And if you match these up, that means over 50% of all respondents said they both had used their reserves last financial year now and would use their reserves again in this financial year that we're currently in. So year-on-year use of reserves, pretty much the definition of unsustainable spending there, because reserves run out. Then we asked about cuts. So where are these cuts happening? For the 2/3 that we're making cuts, it's happening in places like parks and leisure, arts and culture. So these things that most residents will see. Business support is one that in our 2023 survey, this was also seen as a major thing. This doesn't really fit in with the idea of councils as steering the economic growth in their locality. If business support is being cut year on year. Libraries, again, something that lots of councils will see. Lots of residents will see. Highways and transport the same. And then adult social care being cut across these different places is quite worrying, especially considering we all know that the costs of adult social care are increasing. But really what I want to point to on this graph is that this is a quite diverse series of different places where cuts are happening. It's not like every councillor said, oh yeah, we're spending way too much on this thing, especially not after all the years that we've already had of council cuts. 31% of respondents think that the cuts they make will be evident to the public. And then 16% of all respondents think they may be unable to deliver their statutory duties. Now, I'm interested in this number because it's quite different. And this is in the 2024-25 financial year. It's quite different from the 9% who said they were likely to issue a Section 114. So the difference between these two numbers, unable to deliver our statutory services at 16% and issue a Section 114 at 9%, there's a difference there that I think we need to be looking into more about what this means that those additional 7% or so of respondents think is going to happen. Essentially, are you going to run a budget that means you're not delivering your statutory service, but not declare it as a Section 114? Is that, I mean, that appears to be the suggestion, but what that actually means is something that we need to dig into more wherever we can. Commercial activity, worth looking at this. When we spoke about commercial activity, asset sales were the largest type of commercial activity, which I know it's not exactly a type of commercial activity, but it's, I mean, it kind of is if you're selling it off into private hands. So this is very different from last year, where we saw things like housing developments were more popular. Asset sales are now the most popular form of commercial activity that come up. A fifth of respondents said they would be selling assets. And that goes into some of the changes that are being suggested on capitalization and that sort of thing that I am wholly unqualified to talk about. Then we asked about the opinions of central government from the local government sector. This is quite a stunning graph. I am happy with the government's performance on, and then we asked a series of different statements. Considering local government in wider policy decisions was the one that most people agreed with, and only 8% of people agreed that they were happy with considering local government in wider policy decisions. And then it went down to 1.4% on delivering a sustainable funding system. So that's almost nobody in statistical terms are happy with the government's performance on delivering a sustainable funding system. This is lower than last year as well, where it was at the heady heights of 4% or something. So there's now, I would say, critically low confidence across the sector. And just to remind everybody, this was true across authorities with different political makeup. I mean, this isn't really a party political point at all. It was answered by many respondents across different types of council, as I've said before. But yeah, this is worth remembering, this graph, that, well, especially if you happen to work in the central government, that this is the mood of the sector. So we also asked about opinions on different policy measures that could be brought in. So we said, to what extent do you agree that this would have a positive impact on your council's finances? Multi-year financial settlements were extremely popular. 97% agreed that it would have a positive impact. And there were written answers to this that were essentially all about, it makes it easier for us to plan our finances, because at the moment, year on year, are very, very complicated to know exactly how much money you're going to get, especially when, and I learned this from Adrian, the biggest change ever between a provisional and a final financial settlement this year, wasn't it, with the additional 600 million being announced and that sort of thing. So that sort of money just being dropped in partway through financial planning is really, I don't need to tell anyone on this call that makes planning harder. All right. Ending competitive bids for funding, 74%. We asked loads about this last year, about the Levelling Up Fund and the various other types of funds that you can bid for. Essentially, most councils that are bidding on things are wasting at least some of their money because they're bidding on things that they're not successful for. And there's no two ways to really look at that. And I'm sure lots of people on this call will have been involved in writing bids that go absolutely nowhere. And it's hard not to see it as a waste of time, essentially, a waste of resources. I have exactly the same thing bidding for academic grants, and it's not the best use of my time. 100% business rates retention is still very popular. This was popular last year as well. It's quite interesting that it's popular across different regions and different types of councils as well. This is one of those ones that there is a divergence between lots of the academics we talk to are less happy with the idea of 100% business rates retention, because in their view it might lead to inequalities between different councils. But across the sector, there appears to be a widespread confidence in the widespread support for the reform. Reforming council tax down here on 70%. This is very high, but it would be nice to know in what way we want to reform council tax. I sort of wish that I'd written getting rid of council tax here, and then we could see what the support is for just trying something else. But reforming council tax, this is again something we need to look into more about. Well, what kind of reform is necessary? Is it a small tweak, or is it complete abolition and replacing with something else? A local share of national taxes was up there as well at 68%. This is how local government is funded in lots of different places. We've been doing lots of comparative work. I just realized I've just gone over 20 minutes, so I'll be quick now. This is how local government is funded in places like Germany, Japan, and Italy. They will use a large tax that applies across the nation that has widespread public support, something like VAT or income tax, where it has widespread legitimacy, as opposed to something like council tax or a local property tax, which usually has less legitimacy and popularity amongst the public, and they'll spread it out again based on need. I don't need to go in the rest of these, but suffice to say, there was quite a lot of support for most of these changes, except for single local budgets, which were down there at a third of support, which is still not low, but it's not exactly an overwhelming endorsement. So to conclude, the local government sector in England is increasingly in a state of financial crisis. Over half of respondents to the survey told us they were likely to declare effective bankruptcy in the next 5 years, as I've said, and then 9% they were likely to in the next financial year, being this financial year. Confidence in the sustainability of council finances has cratered from 14% down to 4%. Councils are doing everything they can to balance their books. Just from a comparative perspective, the amount of flexibility that councils have in England for raising and spending their money is extremely low. In comparison to, we've been doing this international research that I would recommend everybody go and read, but nearly everywhere else that we've looked at, councils have more flexibility to do what they want with their money, both in terms of raising and spending, except for Scotland. The central-local relationship is in a critically poor state. Only 8% of respondents are happy with central government's performance in considering local government, and that's the highest level of satisfaction that we measured. And yeah, there are popular options for reform, as I just went into. I will stop now and hand over to Dan. Thank you all very much.
That's great. Thanks, Greg. It's really interesting, and I think it is really useful to get a view of our sector in terms of the funding and finance side that isn't just about the hard numbers. It's about what people feel or think about what's going on. And I thought as well, and we'll come back to it in the discussion later on, the bit about what people would like to see happening is interesting. The multi-year settlements, that's been the most popular thing or most important thing. I think that's fascinating. The single local budgets, that could be the thing a new Labour government does if they come in. That's not something that everyone sees as a solution, but that's something that may become more popular later. Dan, I'll just share the slides there. That's can you see that?
I can. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Yeah. Off you go.
Excellent. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Thanks very much, Greg. I thought it was brilliant. Greg was saying that his study's a bit more subjective. Mine's a bit more objective in that it looks at the 22-23 accounts and our balance sheet service. If you move on, Adrian. So we on the 31st of May look at all the accounts that are published and analyse those. And in this session, when thinking about what we might see in 23-24, I've had a really good look at our balance sheet model for 22-23 and tried to put together the 5 biggest questions I would ask, the 5 things that I'm looking out for most when the accounts come out on the 31st of May. And if we move on one, I'll go through each of those questions one by one. So Greg said that 48% of people see that the audit backlog as being a big problem for local authorities. We now look at accounts as when they're published, capture the dates, when they're audited, when the opinions come in. And what we're finding is this is true as of the 3rd of May, so pretty much as of today. We still got 3/4 of authorities that are awaiting their opinion for 22-23, although 85% have now published their 22-23 accounts. Now, it looks like there's going to be a significant number of disclaimed audits. Speak to people who've been told by their auditors that they're not going to get the audits over the line by the audit backlog date of the 30th of September. So still potentially critical, although if we move on to the next slide, what we can see is that the backlog is reducing. What you have there on the left side is in dark blue the audit opinions by date for 21-22, and in the red ones show 22, 23, and then there's a cumulative figure on the right. And I've drawn a line across the position, that thin blue line is the position at April of last year, when 57 opinions had been issued for 21-22, and at the same time this year, as well as catching up with opinions from 21-22, 25 more opinions had been issued at the same point. So there is evidence, albeit very slowly, that the auditors are catching up. But what I'm seeing when I look at particularly of late, is there are a lot more of the backlog of accounts being published seem to be getting published now. So it feels to me that the finance teams are doing their bit. Some of the auditors are doing their bit, but there's still a long way to go if we're going to get to a point where we're back to normal. And if we move on one, Adrian. So Greg's just said that 48% of respondents see this as a problem. I think, looking at it in the round, we can definitely see that finance teams are doing their bit. Still a little bit of backlog on publication, but that's getting caught up, and it's only getting caught up very slightly by the auditors. So a bit more work required by the auditors. Now, in terms of publishing this year, we've done a couple of surveys at sessions we've done, and there is a lot more optimism about in terms of the 23-24 deadline. So my estimate, and it is a very off the top of my head, but based upon questions that we've asked at previous seminars, is that I reckon we'll get at least half of the accounts published on deadline day. And last year it was only 30%. But we're also, I wonder whether the amount of disclaimed opinions might impact upon the finance teams moving forward. Because if you haven't really got you don't know that your brought forward balances have absolutely been signed off, it makes it a little bit harder to publish subsequent accounts without previous opinions on those brought forward balances. But we've seen local government has done that quite well of late, and then has to track back with their auditors to make that right. So that's the accounts audit backlog. It's getting better, but it's getting better slowly. So we move on to the next question, and this is the biggie, and Greg mentioned it a lot, and this is reserves. Now, I should explain this graph. It looks at the reduction or the change rather, in usable revenue reserves expressed as a proportion of core spending power. So core spending power has gone up, so therefore usable revenue reserves needs to go up by a similar amount to tread water. But what we saw last year was significant reductions in reserves, usable revenue reserves. That's a general fund balance, general fund earmark reserves, ignoring schools balances and any dedicated schools grant balances that might be in reserves. They reduced significantly. Now, some of that is due to there being COVID monies still locked into the system in 21-22 that probably were spent in 22-23. But even if you remove that impact, some significant reductions. And I think we're starting to see reductions in areas where there isn't great funding, where there might be lots more financial pressures associated with deprivation and needs in those areas. Let's remember the government hasn't really reflected needs throughout its formulae since 12-13, or it has to some degree with social care grants. You're seeing some, what I would say, fairly unsustainable reductions in reserves in 22-23, which if they were to continue in 23-24, simply would result in that 9% that Greg talked about, maybe declaring 114. And if we move on one slide, we'll see a little bit more granularity. So that previous slide looked at type authorities, now looked at a bit of a regional breakdown. And you see some areas that are doing really not so well, and the reduction in reserves, it might be due to one or two authorities, but what you're finding is actually across the board, there'll be one or two with fairly big reductions, but quite a few with pretty hefty reductions as well. And in some areas of the country and some types of authority, mainly Met and Unitary, they can't sustain these drops for another year. So one of the things we'll be really looking out for is whether we see those. The other thing that's really interesting and that's starting to emerge from our look thanks to Oflog, we did a lot more work on the differing financial health of authorities with and without HRAs. What we're finding on usable revenue reserves, now these are general fund usable revenue reserves, is those authorities with HRAs in 22-23 across the board suffered larger reductions in their general fund reserves. So there's a bit of a potential issue there. It used to be that having a HRA was quite good for your financial health, but I've spoken to a number of authorities with HRAs saying that's not the case anymore, and it looks like there's a slightly deeper impact in terms of general fund reserves on those with HRAs. Now, it might just be a statistical quirk, but actually that's one of the things we'll be looking out for in 23-24. Is there more pressure on those authorities with HRAs? And those of you who have HRAs might have a view on that. If we move on, Adrian, just wanted to look at exceptional financial support authorities. Now, there are 19 of those, as you probably know. Only 8 of them have got to the point where they've issued the 22-23 accounts. I despair to think what might be in the accounts of the 11 who haven't yet managed to publish accounts, but they include Slough, Croydon and Thurrock that have some real issues around their balance sheet. But even if you take those 8 that have managed to publish, you see that their reserves are now dipping at a rate that, again, I would argue is unsustainable, particularly if that rate accelerates in 23-24. And Greg's already indicated that quite a few authorities will expect that. 2/3 of them expecting to use, 77% I think expecting to use reserves in 23-24, and 2/3 24-25. So those under exceptional financial support, we'll look at them a bit more when we look at capital. They're reducing at a much greater rate than the rest of the sector. And if we move on, one takes us to conclusions. So we saw some massive reductions in 22-23, partly due to COVID. The LGIU study that Greg's talked about, it seems to indicate that there will be some pretty sizable reductions again, with the majority of authorities will be using reserves in 23-24. We think if the level of reductions that we saw in 22-23 are repeated over the next 2 years, we're bound to see lots of 114s or exceptional financial support that papers over the cracks, that allows those authorities to borrow for revenue purposes so as to kick the can down to the next Parliament and let them deal with the huge problems that those authorities might have. So that's usable revenue reserves. The next place we'll look at, allied to this is, and this is upper tier only, is the dedicated school grants deficits. So the special educational needs spending is slightly out of control, and what the government has allowed upper tier authorities to do, the cash is out the door, it's spent, it's overspent, but they've allowed until March 26 those deficits to go and sit in an unusable reserve. They're not really unusable because you've already spent the money. I suppose the hope is that they will be addressed before March 26. But what we're finding is massive increases in the years between 19, 20, 21, 22. It's topping out a little bit in 22-23. So another further increase in the deficit position across the board, but it's slowing down. So it'll be again interesting in 23-24 to see if that's continuing. So it's set just under 7% of usable revenue reserves accounts for the DSG deficits. But if we move on one, we see that it's actually, the problem's much greater in county councils and much less great across London, and not such a big issue across all Mets. So counties and unitaries seem to have more of this problem. And again, it'd be interesting to see whether that changes. In London, both in London and out London, in aggregate, DSG deficits fell in 22-23. So it'll be interesting to see if that starts to happen at other types of authorities. And if we move on one now, this just shows all of the 130 odd upper tier authorities that have issued accounts and their position on DSG and their change over the last 3 years. And what you see there is 3/4 of authorities have a DSG deficit. Most of those have seen those increase over the last period. There's one authority whose DSG deficit is now 66% of its total usable revenue reserves, that DSG deficit has grown significantly at the same time that its reserves have dwindled significantly. And at the current run rate, if it follows the 22-23 pattern in 23-24, its DSG deficit will be greater than the reserves that it has to cover them off. So it will be helping the government safety valve saves it, but if it doesn't in 2026, the DSG deficits come back into general reserves, it will have run out, all other things being equal. So if we move on one, so for me, dedicated schools grant deficits are a growing risk to upper tier authorities. Send overspends locked away until 26, but then could come back to bite. In the meantime, the government has got a safety valve, which hopefully will address some of that. But there's no real evidence that it is making a massive difference just yet. It's starting to make a difference. So it'll be really interesting to see in 23-24 if the deficits are still increasing across the board, or whether they are starting to get a handle on them. But that's a significant risk, I would say, for upper tier. Along all those sides, those are the risks of reduced funding, social care pressures, etc. Move on one, Adrian. We're going to move to capital now. So only a few weeks ago, BBC had this on about the Parliamentary Select Committee looking at town hall debt. Our view is that, yes, it's an issue fueled a little bit by government and Oflog and their dodgy measures and data inaccurate measures. But for us, capital is far more nuanced. So when we look at that, we do look at the CFR, which the government has finally decided to start looking at, the need to borrow. But we also look at that in the context of assets. So we look at debt gearing. And one thing, and what I should have said here, these graphs show the direction of travel of Slough and Croydon and Northamptonshire before their 114. You can see there's very clear patterns here, an increasing need to borrow, increasing debt gearing, which will go through the roof when their capitalisation directions start to hit their accounts, but also the capital adjustment account. This is the equity stake reducing, and this is maybe because they're not looking after their assets, they're having to dispose of them, they're depleting, they're not making MRP provision, but actually we think the capital adjustment account is worth looking at. If it's cratering, there's a problem, it's a capital problem. The government goes nowhere near to this information, it just shouts about MRP and having to make provision, which will knock a few authorities out. We think it needs to be more nuanced than that. If we move on, Adrian, what we're finding with debt gearing, that actually for the majority of authorities, so this is the debt as a proportion of the asset value on the balance sheet, it's falling. In 3/4 of authorities, it's falling. In the significant handful, the minority where it's increasing, it really is a problem. What we find is that debt, capital health is getting better at HRA authorities. It tends to be those authorities are paying their debt down, and from their 30-year plans that have got income that helps pay the debt that they put together, something that Oflog kind of missed when it first bought their information out, put all the HRAs into the naughty step. But what we're seeing is those with exceptional financial support, their gearing is going to go through the roof. They're going to get a load of debt and there's no underpinning asset. They're effectively getting debt to pay off revenue problems. And that's where we think the problems will be very significant, but in a minority of authorities. If you move on one, Adrian. So we looked at the exceptional financial support, 19 there, you see 8 that have issued their accounts, 11 that haven't, including 3 very new authorities, 3 new unitaries. Just because they're new doesn't mean that the problems of their predecessors have gone away, rather they've inherited them to the stage where even before putting out accounts, they need exceptional financial support. Such is the problem, I think, with exceptional financial support and the short-sighted nature of it. If we move on one, we should see there the debt gearing now of all upper tier authorities, and the same is true of lower tier authorities, is starting to reduce. So generally, debt's manageable, or it's coming down in a lot of circumstances. But for those with the ESF, and they don't include Thurrock, Croydon, Slough, Birmingham, which would make that upward tick far more pronounced, it's going up. For those authorities, I really wonder whether they, at a time when they're struggling to balance their budget, getting debt out at 5% plus a 1% premium the government's paying, having to pay that back over 20 years through MRP and service that 5-6% debt at a time when they're really struggling, it just doesn't feel sustainable. It feels like a measure to kick the can into the next Parliament. But that's my view. You might not agree with it. Please put in the chat if you don't. Be interesting to hear. If we move on to the next slide, so in terms of conclusions, so debt is a problem, yes, but it's for a minority authority. We think the majority of authorities are doing quite a good job of debt, starting to bring that down. But the focus in the press, and sometimes to hear some of the government spokesmen, you'd think that everybody was in trouble. We don't think that is the case. What we do think, however, and we think the EFS, the Exceptional Financial Support Authorities, are really going to struggle. But for everybody else, there is a problem with debt, and it's to do with interest rates, and it's to do with internal borrowing. And I'll just move on to that in the next slide, this last couple of slides. So will higher interest impact local government financial resilience? Well, undoubtedly, yes, but it's not all bad. If we look at interest receivable notes in all of the accounts, we can see that all authorities have got more interest receivable in 22-23 than they've had over the last couple of years, because interest rates are at 5-6%. All authorities, even those in trouble, have a lot of cash swirling around, so their treasury management policies put it in the money market, make a good return. What we're seeing though is we take the 5 authorities that have got the highest level of current resources, that's reserves and other bits and pieces, and they're making 5.51% of spending power as interest receivable. That's a fantastic amount. It's a windfall because of the interest rates. If we look at the 5 lowest, they're only making just over a percentage point. So yeah, it's still welcome and it's higher than last year, but they're not making as much. So there's a cash flow issue here. That those swimming in cash are doing a lot better. Those that aren't are doing a lot worse. Not only are they not getting returns through treasury management because they haven't got the funds to make it, but they're exposed to really high interest rates. And therefore, if we move on to what I think is my last slide, Adrian, there is a really complex relationship between current resources, which tend to be dwindling as reserves go down, as dedicated school grants deficits go up, and other bits of cash as funding reduces and other funding reduces, and there's not so much cash in the system, and the ability to use that spare cash to internally borrow. So your internal borrowing position is often because you've got lots of cash, it means you don't have to externally borrow. What we started to see in 22-23, and what I predict we'll see in 23-24, is a lot more short-term borrowing at 5%, because authorities just don't have the cash balance, the resources now to sustain an internal borrowing position, the part of their need to borrow, which is internal. And that, I think, is going to be a really big issue, particularly for some authorities. We saw in 22-23 a number of authorities where resources dwindled so much, at the same time they had to externally borrow. A couple of years ago, that would have mattered because they were borrowing at 1%. Now they're borrowing at 5%. So this is something we'll watch really closely. It's something that's sort of hidden in the nuance of the balance sheet, but we think is really going to bite some authorities. And when we've spoken about this, a lot of authorities say, yes, this is an issue for them. Their treasury management now is seeing a lot more short-term borrowing, a lot more long-term external borrowing, which used to be cost them nothing because they borrowed against their resources. Now they're borrowing at rates of 5%. So we think that'll be an issue. And that's it. There are my 5 questions. They're the 5 things we'll look out for. I think there's one more slide, which is just to promote the session that we have on June the 18th. We will look at all of the accounts released on the 31st of May, and we will try to answer these 5 questions. And therefore, our free webinar, which you're all welcome to join, which I'll put the joining instructions into the chat, we will give you the answers to that, or we'll try to give you the answers to those 5 questions. Thanks very much, Adrian.
That's great, Dan. Cheers. Yeah, and 18th of June, that's I've got quite an echo actually. That better? Yeah, a little bit better. Yeah, yeah, that's great. I mean, and I think that 18th of June date, I think you will be giving information there about the state of local government finance before anyone else does. It's straight from the accounts. No one else will have that. Even central government will be waiting for the RO forms to come out later in the year. So that's the first time you'll hear that. So seeing those headline results as they come through will be really, really interesting. For me, I've got a few topics to cover, which I try and get through fairly quickly. The first of those is just to recap on some of the changes that we've made to the MTFP model. I put that on the website a week or so ago, and for the first time I did a little short video to go alongside that. So if you saw that, I hope that was useful. But the key things are that we've made changes to the model. The first one is to add an additional year of new homes bonus in 2025-26. So it allows you to assume this and put it into your forecasts. We've talked quite a bit about whether this is likely or not, and I think our conclusion roughly was that a new government won't really have the time between the general election and the provisional settlement to make any really big changes to the shape of the settlement. So a further year of NHB does seem more likely than not. It will be the 6th one-off payment, which kind of just shows how much the government's been unsure about how to replace new homes bonus or whether to replace it. I'm fairly sure that 25-26 will be the final year, but I think on balance it's probably more likely than not that it will go ahead for another year. I've made no changes to the way NHB payments would be calculated. I think that would result in a payment of about 303 million. They're currently based on the 2023 CTB1. So if you have updated estimates, put those through into the data in the model to recalculate what your figures will be. But we'll update those estimates when the 2024 CTB1s actually come out later in the year. A totally new thing here for the model, the second home council tax premium for 2025-26. Billing authorities have the power to apply the premium to second homes from the 1st of April. Have a look at the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act 2023 for the definition of that. It refers to as dwellings occupied periodically rather than to second homes. So it's that definition of obviously that properties that are not occupied all year round. A decision has to be made at least 12 months before the start of the financial year. So if you haven't done it, it's too late for 25-26. But I'm assuming that everyone who's intending to do it has already made that decision. Within the model, there's some flexibility about how you show that premium. I'm assuming as a default that you'll set that at 100%. I don't see why you would do a lower amount than that, but I have got different assumptions in there if you want to see it. As a default as well, I've assumed that you would use the figures within your CTB1 in 2023 for second homes, but obviously that's quite out of date. You won't have been necessarily updating those figures or chasing or checking them for a few years now. So you may want to overwrite those and use your own local estimates. I'm also going to put a quick poll out there as well, because I'm interested to see how many authorities are actually doing this and how widespread it is. I'm assuming that everyone who wants to do it and able to do it will do so. But I'd be interested to see what your thoughts are. Can you see that, Dan? Yeah. Let's have a think about that. Say again. Oh, you're on mute, Dan.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, 23 out of 27 have said yes.
Yeah, so I'm assuming that will be a thing. I mean, the amount of income is considerable for some places. People, the Devon authorities where you guys are, or in Cornwall, that would be very significant indeed. Yeah. But there's no reason why it needs to be just authorities that have got lots of tourism. It could, any authority could benefit from that, and some surprising authorities have got quite a lot of second homes, at least by the looks of the CTB1. Fire grants we've included for the first time, and thanks to those of you who shared the allocations from previous years that come out from the Home Office. They're not necessarily available on the on government websites, which is quite strange. So I've only been able to get data going back to 2022-23, but at least that gives a view about what's been happening recently and what might happen in the future. We're assuming cash flat for the future. We're showing here the fire pensions grant, the 115 million rolling into SFA in 24-25. That's already happened, and then this new pensions grant that was created in 24-25, 91 million, which the letter indicates will be one-off, and I've got that as an assumption within the modelling that it is one-off. But you can go in and change that if you wish. Changes in the future funding. I've put some more granularity for this in the model because I'm just aware that instead of saying, well, actually, is the assumption for SFA, say, cash flat for the next 5 years, I think it's probably going to be more useful to say, what do we think might happen in 2025 in that first year, that first settlement of a new government after the general election? Because that could be different from what a government decides to do over the next spending review period, which effectively for us will start in 2026-27. So I think there could be we now get to that point where there could be different things happening in different financial years over the next 4 or 5 years. You know, and I'd imagine that from the next spending review, the sector will get a 4-year spending, you know, a 4-year multi-year settlement over that period. Now that might have the same change in SFA in each of those years, but I think it's possibly more likely that it has slightly different numbers in each of those financial years over that period. So I'm just introducing this into the model so that you can think about what those changes would be over that whole period of time. But the default for now for SFA, for fire grants, for RSDG is cash flat. But just to be aware that our range really is from that we'd suggest that you put through in terms of forecasting is +1 in cash terms to -2 in cash terms, just to get an idea about what the range might be from future funding changes. For social care, we are still assuming that everything you've got in your baseline now, you will continue to have in your baseline in 25-26. We're not assuming that even the additional £600 million that came in in the final settlement this year, we're assuming everything that comes through from that stays in your baseline for 25-26 as well, that it's not removed. We are taking the view that there will be further increases in growth in social care funding. We've taken the view that it's at least £500 million per year in each of those next financial years. But of course, you can override that and come up with a different figure. My guess would be anywhere between £0 and £1 billion per year, but it could be different figures for different years as well. So just trying to build in some of that granularity. And then finally on this thread, some new assumptions around the funding reforms and how you might model them. We've not made any changes about what we think those funding reforms will be or when they will happen. We're still thinking they'll be 26, 27. But these are just some amendments and changes you can make around the edges. The first one being, you can assume that damping, instead of being based on a 5% total resources floor, in other words, that no authority can have a reduction in their total resources of more than 5%. What we've introduced is a new additional option, which is to say, you know, if you're losing from the funding reforms, assuming that those losses are spread over 4 or 5 years, that's slightly more generous. It gives people a bit more damping support, but that's more expensive. So either the government's going to find more money to fund that kind of damping, or the scale of scaling back for authorities that are gaining will be even greater, which won't be popular. The other change is to give you the option for scaling back gains in the baseline reset. I'm sure you'll see in the model in the MTFP tab that we kind of highlight any return surplus from the baseline reset as a high risk item, simply because you know, it's a lot of money and we don't know for sure how the government will handle that. We still think that's a good modelling assumption, but clearly if you're forecasting, you may want to scale back some of those gains just to be a bit more prudent. So that's another option that you can work through. For any of these things, feel free to drop me a line and we can take it offline and talk through in more detail about how that would affect you directly. We had a quick look at the CTR ones for council tax for 24-25, and kind of reflecting what Greg said there as well. Pretty much every authority in the country has used their maximum increase in Band D. So you'll see there for England as a whole, the average increase was 5.1%. But if you kind of go through the next group of authorities, those with social care responsibilities, averaging about 5%, some down at 4.8%, but broadly pretty much on the maximum increase that you're able to have. Same with districts as well, 3%. And we go right the way through those authorities. Pretty much everyone is using the maximum amount that's available to them. Only a few were off the maximum increase. Ones with, as we might have expected, having the lowest increase, just over 2%, but quite a handful of others at a lower level. Only one county council did not apply the full increase. That was Nottinghamshire, but that was 4.84%, so effectively right up at that top end. All authorities used the full adult social care precept. Then we had those 4 authorities that have got the specific thresholds. They're 10% thresholds, although those with social care responsibilities, 2% of that is for the ASC precept. So it's slightly split differently, but effectively the same overall threshold. And 2 of those used the full amount, or close to it. Slough and Thurrock didn't. Only 22 district councils, that's 13%, did not use the full 2.99% threshold, and as far as I can make out, only 27 were able to use the £5 threshold. So that's becoming of less and less use to shire districts. And I think it's almost obsolete, and I know that lots of shire districts are pressing for that to be increased from £5 up to £10. Looking at fire authorities, a very similar situation here. I think I would say really, pardon me, only 3 fire authorities not using their full 3% increase. That's Nottinghamshire, Cambridgeshire, and Essex. No authority had no fire authority had an increase in precept of more than £3.43. So that the return of the £5 threshold will be really welcome to virtually all fire authorities. So I think that's something that I'm sure fire authorities will be pressing for, and which would make quite a considerable difference. We're starting to look a bit more at the combined authorities. 4 of them use their precept. That's Greater Manchester, West Yorkshire, Peterborough, and Cambridgeshire. Cheekily, I include the GLA as a combined authority sometimes these days. I know it's not technically so, but it's got a lot of the same attributes, and obviously the GLA put its precept up a good deal as well this year. The average increase in parish precepts, interesting enough, was 8.5%, so way above principal authorities, but I just don't see that being an issue for a future government. It's just too messy, it's just too difficult, and the numbers are just too small in the end. Tax base is kind of interesting in that I think in 2 ways. One, the increase is still above what I would kind of think of as being the long-term trend. Normally I kind of think the long-term trend is about 0.75%, but it's been going up by more than that for quite a while now. That's partly about valuation list growth, but I think it's more about the reduction in the cost of council tax support, which has been kind of a surprisingly continuing trend over quite a long period of time. London's an odd situation here in that Inner London has the lowest increase, just over 1%. Outer London has the highest increase, illustrating that London is not a homogenous block at all. And even within some of those classes and regions, rather, the range is striking. So from within London, for instance, Enfield plus 7.66%, City of London minus 3.28%, a huge range within the capital. But even in, say, in the northwest, you've got Salford at 3.88%, Lancaster languishing at 0.1%. So big differences in different parts of the country, which has a big impact, obviously, on the amount of resources you've got over the longer term. We're more or less at 11 o'clock now, so I've got a few final slides on the Labour manifesto and what that might mean for funding. I'll do a briefing note on this as well that I'll issue later in the week, because I think there's some quite important things which I'll very briefly just pick out here. I think the main one is that the financial weakness in local government will make it harder for if there is a Labour government, to implement any significant changes in funding distribution. Massive pressure on the public finances and massive pressure on local government too. And I'm just wondering whether having this sort of one-off settlement for 25-26 very shortly after the election and before the spending review might possibly be a good thing for local government. Will an incoming Labour government want to have big real terms cuts in local government funding being one of its first actions? I suspect not. Maybe it won't be so bothered, but I think that could be an issue. Then council tax Band D is something that I've been worried about a little bit, based on what Labour was saying back at the local elections this time last year, when they talked about freezing Band D, what they referred to as a tax cut for the 99% of working people, not repeated, fortunately, in the current manifesto for 24. And actually quite a lot of criticism of the increase in Band D since 2010, saying it's doubled since the last Labour government. But fortunately, no indication that Band D thresholds would actually be lower under a Labour government. So we're continuing for now with the thresholds that we've got: 4.99% for social care, 2.99% for fire authorities and shire districts. But one comment I'd picked out from Ellie Reeves on Times Radio last month, talking about we have to be realistic, and trying to put local government on a stable footing, which to me suggests that they will continue to allow councils to put Band D up by similar sorts of levels as we've seen in recent past. I do think, and I do hope, that they will think more about a multi-year settlement. Clearly, having a full run at a spending review over 4 years gives them the opportunity to do that. And it's interesting seeing what Greg had found in his survey, that actually that was the thing that councils most wanted to see. So maybe and hopefully that will be something that we do see if there is a new Labour government and what they do when they have the chance to do a 4-year settlement. But no mention of a fairer funding settlement or changing funding distribution. That might just be because that wasn't the right forum in the manifesto. But I do wonder whether the scale of the pressure on the sector, on public finances, will actually make it a lot harder to do that. So I think we're kind of out of time, so I'll draw a line under it there. As I said, for that, the stuff on the Labour manifesto, I'll put a briefing note out anyway, and we can talk about that. I'm sure we'll talk about that in a lot of detail over the coming months. But for now, if you need to go, thanks for coming along. Thanks to Greg for coming along and talking us through that really interesting report. And thanks, Dan, as well. Great stuff. Yeah, how was that, Greg? It's good.
Yeah,
it's really interesting stuff. Really interesting stuff. I mean, for me, the survey about what people wanted was fascinating. That they wanted. It's like, I think councils, they want, if there's bad news, you want to know it way in advance so you can plan.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that shows in the support for multi-year financial settlements and the support for ending competitive bid funding, because both of those increase your level of, including, it means that you know how much you're going to get. So yeah. Even though you might end up with more if you're a big local authority who usually wins bids, there was still support for getting rid of them.
Yeah, it's just easier, isn't it? You know what you get in, less effort. I thought the poll was interesting as well, that 87% of people saying that they will use the premium for second homes in 25-26. 10% no, a further 3% thinking about it for the future. I guess it's not free money as such, but it's an easy one to bring in extra money, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I think though it's one of those, again, it's can be a bit skewed, isn't it? Like business rates gains, like council tax.
Yeah.
Some areas, like you said, where Greg and I are in Devon, should do quite well from it. And actually, that wouldn't be bad for where I live, because I do appallingly badly from business rates gain, because 2/3 of it is Dartmoor, and there's no motorways or airports anywhere near us. So it's swings and roundabouts. But there'll be lots of authorities that just think this is another thing that we don't gain from. We haven't gained from new homes bonus, tax-based funding guarantee, business rates gains, and we're still not going to gain from this. So it feels to me like they need to do a more thorough review of some form of equalisation through council tax, if that's possible.
Yeah, actually, Dan, there's some interesting comments in the chat. Tina, North Norfolk, be over £500,000, becomes quite big money, and then obviously to the county as well, it's even more in cash terms. Lisa saying, capturing the data could be tricky if no obligation. There hasn't been any requirement to say whether your home is a second home or not. And then Graham asking, will the increased income from second homes impact the resources element of the formula? I'm not sure whether it will or not. My guess is they will probably try and keep it outside that. So you only equalise the core bit of tax base, and leave the second home premium to one side. That'd be my assumption. I don't know though.
Have you got Tina's got a hand up?
Oh, Tina, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. I was going to say, it is going to be a great benefit to us as a district council. But I mean, even for the county, what we'll raise is a huge amount for the county, and we're looking at trying to negotiate with the county in terms of them agreeing to put back into the district in terms of helping with, we've got a terrible, which is, I suspect, like Dan has as well, issue with affordable homes for local residents, so we're hoping that the money can be used for that, really.
Yeah. I mean, that's something you think you'll try and do, Tina, keep it, sort of ring fence it for specific things that are related to the impact of second homes?
Well, I hadn't allowed for that in my medium-term financial plan. I'd assumed, that it would all be just available for general use, but I think a couple of the members would like it ring-fenced, which puts a great deal of pressure now on our MTFS, if it
Yeah.
is, but it makes up for our £5,000 new homes bonus that we're getting.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a recurring thing, isn't it, Tina? At the start, people put new homes bonus aside for projects, but over time they had to use it to balance a budget. Business rates gains as well. I know a number of authorities that make massive business rates gains, but a lot of them are based in the budget, such were the size of the cut. So we'll now be in trouble when it's reset and that income flows out. So all of these extras, they feel like they should be used to mitigate the things that happen from second homes, etc. But they don't. They end up going just to ensure that the council can balance its budget, which again points to a fairly unsustainable funding system.
And that's what that is the bottom line, isn't it? It's an unsustainable funding system, and it is just broken. But I can't see that it's going to change anytime in the near future. No. Thank you.
No, actually, Tina, one last question. Have you found it, or do you think it'll be difficult to get the second homes data? Do you think it's the data you've got is good quality, or do you think you'll have to do quite a lot of work to verify it and check it with second homeowners?
We've got a very good revenues manager. His name's Sean Knight, and he's always got his finger on the pulse, and his data usually seems fairly solid. So I think that we'll be okay in that respect. He's not suggested that it's going to be difficult to collect. I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting to see whether people, how people kind of go out to, the wider tax base to check, people's status and that kind of thing. I guess some places you'll need to do some more of that kind of work, I guess.
Well, we think we might get, a bit of attrition in terms of swapping to business rates, that they'll set them up as small business. And then, we're not getting the benefit then of that because of the small business rates relief that they'll get.
Or redesignating places as primary or secondary residences.
That's it. Yeah.
Stuart, I don't know if you're still on the call at all. It'd be interesting. I don't know if Stuart is around. I'm not sure. I saw Stuart come in earlier, but I'll just be interested to see what Stuart thinks about how the department would view income from second home premium, and whether they would, want to equalise it, or whether it's something that would stay outside it. I think when there was a discount, I can't remember that, Dan. When there was a discount for second homes, was that outside the system?
I think so. I mean, certainly on the CTR, they're in CTB, they're in different places. So they can do, just like council tax support can be excluded. I mean, I'll be interested to know what they do on resources equalisation and council tax support, because some authorities have got much higher levels of council tax support and have lost out tax base. But whether they'll seek to do something about that or not, I don't know. So they've definitely got the apparatus to separate it. I know that, but whether they will or not, I'm not sure. And I suppose it's something that's up for grabs, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think Stuart might have dropped off.
Yeah, I think so.
Can I just ask a question on everyone about the confidence around the accounts for this year? Is my prediction of 50%, half of the accounts being done on deadline day? Do you think that's a decent guess, or what's your view in terms of stick it in the chat, if you will, or shout? Is everyone on target to go for a 31st of May publication of accounts, or am I wildly off there? People struggling.
I'll do a quick poll then.
I have to learn how to do quick polls, Adrian. They're good. Darren did a quick one for us at our last one, and 60% of about 80 people said they were going to publish on the 31st of May, and then a lot of people said it won't be far behind that date. So some 70%-ish. So it feels like some of the issues are cleared, but I say what I said earlier. I think local government finance teams are doing their bit. That they're getting on and doing it, they've overcome. I can see a lot of them catching up. It'll now be up to the auditors to do their bit, won't it, and try and get this backlog addressed and trying to get us back on. Go on, Tina.
Yeah, I mean, it's the opening balances, isn't it? I mean, we can say that we'll be able to publish, but it's the credibility of the opening balances which we'll be struggling with. I mean, I think we could quite easily reach our outturn position, but getting the actual draft accounts published will be difficult, I think.
And are you finding it's a struggle with back to the infrastructure assets and the pensions, or is it the auditors that are dragging their feet a little bit, or not enough staff, or what sort of issues do you think there are that are sort of preventing the whole thing? Is it mainly on the audit side?
Well, the audit does take a lot of resource up in terms of responding to the queries, but we are struggling in terms of staffing. We find it difficult to attract with being sort of a bit of an outlier. That is the big struggle for us. So we've got 21-22, which is just about finished. 22-23, we're working on that, and we've got somebody on an interim basis that's been with us getting on for 18 months, I suppose. That's working more or less exclusively on accounts. She'll be a whiz for anybody else that wants her when we've done with her.
and I suppose it becomes exponential, doesn't it? If you're not able to close down and be satisfied with those figures, it makes everything that much harder going forward, not knowing that you've had signed off figures. And that, if you have 3/4 of these, keep forgetting the word, begins with D, opinions.
They're going to give us a. I can't remember what. I can't remember what it's called now. Disclaim.
That's it. Disclaimed opinions.
Something.
I know that focusing on VFM. Well, I'm never really sure what the auditors do on VFM, if I'm honest. It is those balances that you want. That want them to give assurance on, isn't it? So you can get on. And I guess that, for me, local government's doing its bit now, and it'd be a shame if it got dragged back by disclaimed audits, meaning that authorities were nervous to publish accounts because they haven't yet got any assurance from their auditors on past closing balances and therefore new opening balances. That would be a real shame. But interesting, 72% here. So again, that every time we ask looks like it's it's a bit more optimistic. And that Jonathan's just written. So many people have told me that they're not going to even be on site until the deadline date for audit. I think that's the norm. It's not the exception. I guess if they do clear the backlog and then get straight to it, that's not a bad thing, is it? But there's lots of NHS audits in the way now, and you'd want to think that they are catching that backlog up at a rate that's quicker than that they currently are doing with, or else this is going to go on for years and years.
There was one. So actually, Lisa, you made a couple of comments there. One about the performance enhancements being enhanced, or the performance requirements being enhanced in the audits, not due to start until October. Backlog taking the priority, Dan. Yeah.
But it's interesting because is the backlog taking the priority, or a number of people I've spoken to, their auditors said that's it, we're off to the NHS now for the next 3 months. We'll see you again late summer, early autumn, and that it feels like it. In some areas it's down tools, although I have to say very little happened April last year and lots happened April this year, so it might be that some of that extra resource has been thrown at it. But go on, Lisa. Tell us how it is.
So our audit team have said that they, like the external audit team, have said that they are obviously NHS priority, and then backlog from July, and we're up to date. So we published on time every time. Obviously that we didn't publish the finals on time because they didn't audit us on time. But this is going to be the first one. But this is our latest audit ever. and it kind of is compromising our position a little bit, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, the integrity of the teams that are trying to meet the deadlines. Well, no one cares anymore, do they? And I am in the camp that said this is a pointless exercise. It doesn't impact how we set our budget, how we set our council tax. You know, it is just, well, and you know, with the new audit fees as well, it's absolutely criminal. It's a huge chunk of our budget that we've now, you know, with absolutely no benefit to anybody.
I'd absolutely agree, and it's a real shame when you sort of say that nobody cares, because actually, if you look at the authorities in real trouble, they're usually 3 or 4 years behind on their accounts as well. So actually, we don't know of the authorities that haven't published whether there are big issues there, because we can't see. So people should care, but it's got to the point where it's, you know, the system has fallen down so much. It's
yeah,
hard.
I mean, the focus is totally wrong. I mean, I bang on about this all the time. I know I'm bore people to death on it, but it is just, you know, some of those that are in trouble had perfect accounts, didn't they? So it's the accounting regime is just totally broken. And it's the budgeting that we should be focusing on, not how much our bloody town halls are worth.
That's a point. That's a good point. Greg, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was just reminded when Lisa was talking about pointless exercises of the productivity things coming in July, these productivity plans.
Yeah.
I wondered if anyone,
let's not even start on that.
that's what I wanted to ask about. If anyone
Pointless,
has
yeah.
been involved
Pointless.
in these, and what the general thoughts are about them, because they involve various elements of local government financial reporting. I mean, there's quite a lot of data asked for in this letter. Is my thinking, but.
I saw a brilliant post on LinkedIn from an AI specialist in local who works in local government. He said he put his authorities a couple of their documents through and the government requirements, and within 2 minutes the AI machine had produced him a perfect productivity statement that he thinks would pass muster, just from playing around with bits of data. So that kind of, to me, shows how ludicrous it is, and
it's a productivity improvement in itself.
Yes, absolutely. 2 minutes for an AI bot to write your productivity statement. You can't. If only accounts could be done that way.
Yeah. Maybe that's a solution for competitive bid-based funding as well.
Yeah.
You just submit using AI. Yeah. Actually, Greg, looking back at your slides, actually, the one that I thought was the most worrying, really, was that one, confidence in council finances. Partly because the 4%'s really low, but the other thing about it was it's a time series. So you've asked the same question over a period of time. You know, in some ways, you should have thought that 2017 was worse than now, because that was the end of a run of 7 years of cash terms cuts in funding. That should have been worse, but it is worse now, even though, as I keep saying, we've had 3 or 4, 5 years of really good settlements in cash terms. But it's just that spending's gone up by even more. It's a spending side that seems to be that's out of control. That's hard to control. The funding's been actually relatively good. So for me, that just illustrates the point that we are at.
Yeah, and that shows up elsewhere in the survey when we ask about responsibilities growing without an increase in funding. But it's not only responsibility; it's just costs, and this cost may be because of new responsibilities, but it's also because of inflation and increasing interest rates and you know, all these different things. So yeah, I mean, I completely agree, and it's a real shame that we couldn't do this survey during the pandemic. It was before I joined LGRU, but it would have been interesting to see what else happened with the confidence in council finances during that time, because I get the feeling, looking back, it was quite a strange few years, and I think it would have been useful to know what was going on there. But I agree with your assessment. It is worrying, and I do wonder whether some of it is because of these very high profile Section 114s and the increasing frequency of Section 114s is sort of, people are going, okay, well, it clearly can happen anywhere. And, you know, previously where you might be primarily thinking about the effect on your own council's budgets and that sort of thing, it's now a national story all the time that this is happening across councils across the country. So
yeah. Be fascinated. Actually, I wish you did have a longer time series of that, Greg, because be fascinated to plot that against Dan's time series of usable revenue reserves, and but it might have a similar sort of trend.
It's not a dissimilar trend, I'm guessing. That's what'd be so interesting this year. If you've 77% of people say they've used usable revenue reserves this year, then I think there are some on the left-hand side of my graphs that, they used more reserves last year than they now have, which means that they haven't got another year's depletion at the same rate. It will send them into negative territory, and nothing that your respondents have said have made me think that corner has turned yet. I think the DSG one might. It's turned a corner. It's still a problem, but reserves, I think it'll look really grim. And for the first time, I think those in 114 territory haven't got a single issue like a bad decision or like equal pay or whatever it might be. They are just they've been battered for so long that actually it's now, they might be otherwise well run, but they just can't sustain such of the pressures and such some of the funding quirks that are out of favour for them.
Exactly, and that's a sort of statistical inevitability. If half of councils do go bankrupt over the next parliament, and it is a warning rather than a prediction, but I mean, what would the alternative be? That half of councils are terribly run? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense by that point. It's completely impossible to imagine that it's anything other than a structural issue.
A fascinating comment from Tony. They just received a freedom of information request from Sky News asking whether the council has considered submitting a section 114 since 21. That really puts you on the spot, doesn't it, Tony? What's the threshold for considering? That's the challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I'm assuming that Sky will have asked everybody in the country. My guess.
Probably, yeah.
Probably, yeah. But I mean, that shows you they're interested. That's reached the threshold where they think it's worth putting the effort into doing that kind of survey.
And it's strange. I don't know what people think. It's been a while since I've been 151, but there used to be a real stigma attached to 114, and you do everything in your powers to avoid that. It was, some say it was seen as a bit of a career suicide move, but now I think it is. It wouldn't surprise me for a lot of authorities that have considered it. It's part and parcel. It's one of the tools that you might use, isn't it? It should be considered, I would suggest, alongside other things, because it's a very real consideration for now the majority of authorities. Whereas in the past, you just didn't utter it, did you, for fear that the ceiling would collapse on you?
Yeah. But I think the difference as well, Dan, is that in the past there was always the sort of the assumption that it should be possible for every council to set a balanced budget, even if it was difficult. There was always enough resource to do it. Whereas I think there's a sense, and I think Greg's chart just earlier just illustrates that, there's a sense now that there may well not be enough. It may not be possible to set that balanced budget. And that's the difficult thing. The section 114 notice just tells you to go back and think again, or is a tool for the section 151 to go back to the members and say, think again and make sure you set a balanced budget. Whereas if you can't do that, that system doesn't work in the same way as it did. And I think that's why you end up with commissioners and intervention and all the rest of it, because there comes a point where you can't yourself make the right decisions to balance the budget.
Yeah, and I've heard a number of people have sort of spoken about implement the sort of processes that come along with section 114 but fall short of declaring 114 because of all of that interest that comes first from the press, then from the government, and then from commissioners who are sent in. And I think there'll be a few that are kind of acting almost like it's 114 commissions without the formal declaration because of all of that extra. Some of the 114s, when I look at their websites, some of the red tape is just incredible. It makes me wonder whether it's easy just to keep running the day job when you're feeding this massive thirst for more and more information.
Yeah. You know what, Greg? I think Sky News have read your report and are thinking, I want to know who's in that 51%. That's what they want to see.
I apologise if that is what's happened. Yeah. It's quite interesting actually what you two were just talking about this the section 114 as a kind of something that can no longer be avoided or that should be considered, because when we looked at places like Germany and Italy and Japan, what they do have that we don't is pretty sophisticated ideas produced by central government in combination with local government of how much local government needs in order to fulfill its statutory obligations. They'll have a number that that local governments have to reach in order to be able to do everything that's required in law of them, which is usually quite easy to figure out as well, unlike here. But then they'll have something where you can say, okay, well this local government isn't going to be able to do everything that we expect it to be able to do, so it needs more money and that sort of thing. And that's just so far away from where we are now.
Yeah, it really is. That takes quite a step back and proper kind of collaboration to work something out, rather than an adversarial approach that we've got, really.
Well, yeah, and in all these places that we've looked at, they have constitutional requirements for collaboration between central and local government, and they have constitutional protections for local government, so that like the example I always give, in Italy, ring fencing of local government budgets is illegal. You can't do it.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, you can challenge it in the court.
Didn't know that.
Yeah.
But I guess you get things here like I don't know, I can't remember what the piece of legislation would have been, but so the Children's Act back in whatever 2014 that's created the the children's healthcare, education, healthcare documents, whatever I've got them called now, or plans, education and healthcare plans. That's driven a huge amount of cost in lots of councils. I can't believe that the assessment that came out alongside that envisaged anything like it, and there's been no review of that or no attempt to put money in to support what that decision by a previous government. And I guess that's exactly what you're talking about, isn't it, Greg? That they've passed the responsibility on to local government now, and it's kind of our responsibility to deal with it, and that's that.
Yeah, and the channels for communication in England between local and central government are sort of, again, like almost non-existent. I mean, there's no central forum where they have to meet and discuss things and agree on things in the way that is very common across the rest of the world.
Yeah. Maybe things will change. Yeah. That's great. I think we're pretty much at our end of our allotted time. So let's end it there. Thanks very much for that, Greg. That was brilliant. Really different stuff. Yeah. Really good insights into things that we don't always see. So that was fantastic. And that's great, Dan. Brilliant. I'll get the recording done soon. Get it straight on the website.
Great.
Oh, thank you all very much.
Thanks for coming along.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thanks for contributing. Thanks, Tina. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Cheers. Thank you. Yeah.
Cheers.